This is the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. The impact of the Israeli occupation of Palestine extends far beyond the disputed borders of the region. Israeli companies, many with close ties to the government and military, export weapons and surveillance technology across the globe. Palestinians and their communities serve as test subjects, where potential clients can witness the impact of Israeli technology in an urban warfare setting. Award-winning journalist Antony Loewenstein details this dynamic in his book, The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. It was published by Verso earlier this year. Mondoweiss U.S. correspondent Michael Arria recently spoke to Lowenstein about his reporting.
Okay, so to start here, at the beginning of your book, you talk about growing up in a Jewish liberal Zionist family and how your view of the situation has evolved over the last 20 years. You write that it, quote, mirrors the growing global awareness of what Israel has always been and where it's headed. Can you talk a little bit about your personal connection to this issue and how your understanding of it has shifted over the last 20 or so years?
So when I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and for those who don't know, Australia's got a Jewish population of around 100,000 people, so relatively small. But Australia is known as being very pro-Israel, has been for years, very much since Israel's birth, and pretty much remains a very strong ally of Israel in the US. So when I was growing up in the 1970s, it was pretty common to support Israel. My family were not fanatical about it, but most of my family were killed in the Holocaust, sadly, and the ones who got out in 1939 escaped to wherever they got a visa, so US, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. And the ones who came here, they would mostly come from Germany and Austria. And they were not, as I said, fanatical Zionists, but for them, there was a comfort. And I guess I understood this to some extent back then, and even to some extent now, why Israel would be seen as a so-called safe haven, God forbid something happened again for that generation. Not that they particularly, all of them were fanatical about Palestinians or ignored the occupation. I mean, as far as they were concerned, we didn't talk about the occupation. It didn't come up. And as time went on, I suppose, I started really noticing this probably in my teens, so in the late 80s. I guess it was around the time of the first Intifada. And all we were seeing in our media really were scenes of Palestinian uprising, Palestinian violence. This is how it was framed, at least in the Jewish community. And it was pretty disturbing to me how much racism I heard, how much intolerance I heard in my family and in the wider community towards Palestinians, towards Yasser Arafat, who was then the Palestinian leader. And I didn't have the language or understanding back then to really fully challenge that, but it was deeply problematic for me. And I guess over time I started questioning that, reading much more widely, and fast forward to the last 20 or so years when I first went to Israel. Palestine was 2005. I was there researching my first book, My Israel Question, and which came out in 2006. And I, to some extent, I guess, knew what to expect, but obviously hadn't seen it myself, hadn't experienced it myself. And it was a pretty wide awakening. I went to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, across Israel. And back then, I said I supported a two-state solution. I support the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. Now my views have changed. They've evolved. As I talk about in the beginning of the book, I now believe in one state. I don't believe the concept of a Jewish state is just, but I feel equally the same about a Christian state or a Muslim or Hindu state. Just any kind of religious state by definition is discriminatory. And of course, during those last 20 years, I think as my views have evolved, I think that's mirrored also in a lot of the wider community also changing their views, and certainly the Jewish community for sure.
Your book covers how Israeli oppression has spread across the globe far beyond Palestine. A lot of those stories previously untold or barely told, classified in many cases. But one of those stories that has actually gotten some mainstream attention in recent years, we've certainly covered it at the site, is the NSO group and its Pegasus hacking software. And that's a situation that was so extreme that the company even ended up on a U.S. government blacklist. For those who don't know, can you talk a little bit about that company? Who are they? Who were their clients? And how did they use the technology?
So NSO Group is an Israeli company that founded around 15 or so years ago by 3 Israeli men. They all pretty much had experience in the IDF. Some of them had worked in intelligence gathering, and that's pretty common, in fact, as I report in the book, how the vast majority of Israeli, obviously defense companies, but also certainly surveillance companies, usually have veterans from the intelligence services. Unit 8200 is the most notorious. Their job essentially 24/7 when they're in the army is to monitor and surveil all Palestinians 24/7. When they leave that service, they often go into the private sector and develop companies like NSO Group. So initially it was really around hacking into Blackberries. Of course, as time went on, that evolved to iPhones and Android. Essentially, it's a tool that allows a user, and it's usually a government entity, military intelligence, police department, something like that, in a state to take control of your phone, to be able to listen to your messages, to read your text messages, to read your emails, look at your photos, to essentially control your phone. Now, years ago, it used to require a random text message. You get some weird text, you click on a link, you kind of forget about it and you just move on. That often is what activated the tool on your phone. These days, it's something called zero click, which doesn't even require that at all anymore. Just literally just all the person or the company needs is your phone number. And we don't actually even know how many countries Pegasus has sold to, but it's in the high dozens for sure. Democracies and dictatorships. The country that's most addicted to it, believe it or not, is actually Mexico. Utterly obsessed with this tool. They were one of the first clients of NSO Group back in the day that was used to fight the supposed drug war. And El Chapo, the notorious drug dealer who's now in a US high security prison, was captured partly because the Mexican government was using NSO Group's Pegasus. But really since then it's metastasized. I mean, the company claims it's only used to track terrorists and criminals, which is nonsense. It certainly has been used for that, but it's also massively used to go after human rights activists and journalists and anyone who's critical of various state entities. And we're talking about a range of countries: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Rwanda, India. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And one of the things I talk about in the book, though, is that although Pegasus is for sure an infamous example in the last years that got a lot of attention around Israeli spyware, one of the things that was often missing from the coverage in the West was it was often framed as this rogue Israeli company selling awful spyware to regimes. Now, the selling of the spyware is true, but what's missing is that often it was used as a diplomatic arm of the Israeli state. So Netanyahu was prime minister, the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, would go to various countries that did not have particularly great relations with Israel and hold out Pegasus as almost like a diplomatic carrot, essentially saying, we will sell you this unbelievably powerful tool if you are friends with us, if you buy our weapons, if you vote for us in a certain way at the UN, whatever it may be. And that's often how it's worked from country after country after country. So as I talk about in the book, NSO Group really is only a private company in name. It's essentially an arm of the state. It is, yes, it has a board and it makes profits. And so on paper, it might look like a private company, but actually it's an arm of the state used by Israel, as for that matter, many of its defense companies are, as a way to further its foreign policy agenda. So whereas now NSO Group is mired in controversy, it still is selling products allegedly to less repressive regimes. But the fact is, as NSO Group's star has started to fall, huge numbers of other Israeli spyware companies have come up. And I talk about this a bit in the book, but I've written about it a bit since even the book came out a few months ago, is that the US government under Biden has sanctioned a lot of these Israeli companies. So on the face of it, it looks like a really good move. They're against human rights abuses, but actually, I don't think it's anything to do with that. I think it's a lot more to do with the fact that the US under Biden wants to actually protect US companies developing these kinds of weapons and tools. And so it's really a turf issue. They want to challenge or put pressure on Israeli companies that are actually challenging US weapons supremacy around the world, because Israeli spyware has become one of the most popular in the world.
There was more coverage than usual earlier this summer of the human rights situation in India as a result of Prime Minister Modi coming to the United States. He gave a joint address to Congress. Some congressional members actually skipped the address in protest, but obviously celebrated, lavishly welcomed by the Biden administration. You write in the book about India's relationship with Israel and this kind of ideological connection that the two countries have now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, India and Israel traditionally were not particularly good friends. During the Cold War, the Indians are much more aligned with the Soviets. And although there was some relations between India and Israel, it wasn't massively close. And that really changed hugely from 2014. I mean, it started before then, but it accelerated in 2014 when Prime Minister Modi took office. And he really then, even before he became Prime Minister, had a really troubling record of serious, not just accusations, but pretty clear evidence of assisting in mass pogroms against Muslims in India. He was even banned for a time for even coming to the US. I mean, he was seen as that extreme. So he becomes Prime Minister in 2014, and the relationship between India and Israel really accelerates. And that, of course, is during the Netanyahu era. And yes, India buys huge amounts of weapons from Israel, so it's partly a defense relationship. But actually, as you say, it's way more than that. It's an ideological alignment. They both, I think, really admire each other's ethno-nationalist agenda. So Israel, of course, is a Jewish supremacist state, prioritizes Jews over anybody else, whereas India is, of course, prioritizing Hindus over anybody else. And India really now is the largest country in the world, has the biggest population in the world, roughly 1.45 billion. It's overtook China this year, according to the UN. And it's the biggest self-described democracy in the world. And despite that, there are massive red lights about Modi's intentions, Modi's actions. There are now regular pogroms against Muslims, of which there's about 200 million. Now, obviously, all that's happening not because of Israel. India is doing horrible things because the Modi government is a Hindu fundamentalist regime. But what is happening in relation to Israel is that huge numbers of Indian officials talk regularly about how much they admire what Israel is doing, both in its so-called war on terror against Palestinians, but also what it's doing in Palestine. So you have Indian officials talking openly about admiring the occupation of Palestine and wanting to do something similar in Kashmir, which is a Muslim majority part of India, bringing in, which they're already doing, huge numbers of Hindu, essentially settlers, to colonize the land. And that's what they're doing slowly but surely. Kashmir is regularly cut off from the world from communication. Internet is regularly shut down. There's barely any international attention on Kashmir. And that's, I think, partly because, as you said, the US has warmly welcomed Modi. Various other leaders around the world, including the Prime Minister of my country in Australia, has sort of slobbered over Modi, really, because they're not India. And that, to me, is really dangerous because India, there's various signs of this, is moving towards wanting to build a Hindu fundamentalist state where any non-Hindus are discriminated against and given second-class citizens. And I guess the way I talk about it in the book is that I very much see India and Israel in 2023 as quite similar to Israel and apartheid South Africa back in the day during the apartheid era. And what I mean by that is South Africa used to buy huge amounts of weapons from Israel, but actually it was more than that. They deeply admired each other's racism, essentially, one against blacks and one against Palestinians. And in the modern era, of course, Israel also inspires many other ethno-nationalist states, Hungary being the most obvious. And this is something really why I wrote the book, apart from being work of investigation as a journalist. It's also really a warning to say, I fear that this century is one where more and more nations are embracing ethno-nationalism, India being the most obvious example. And Israel is really seen as the model. It's seen as the ultimate model. It's not just seen as a model because it's discriminating against non-Jews, but also because it's getting away with it. Israel has essentially global impunity, and many other states admire that, which of course ties into the arms industry, why Israel sells huge amounts of weapons to over 130 nations in the world in the last decades. And I see that in some ways as like an insurance policy, that if Israel sort of feels that if there is a growing tide of opposition to its activities, which could well happen, and we hope that it does, they feel that many nations are less likely to criticize them in any serious way because they're so desperate for Israeli arms. And I think in the short to medium term, Israel's probably right.
Your book covers how, and really, where the title emerges from, how this technology, these tools of repression, are first used on the Palestinian population. And they almost serve, while they're being used in these brutal ways, as a kind of showcase for other countries to see it on display and potentially purchase it themselves. Can you talk about that dynamic? Maybe give an example of where we've seen that in recent years, where we see this repression of Palestinian people, and then there's a move to kind of use that technology from other countries.
With Israel's longest occupation of modern times, since 1967. The book talks about obviously since 1948 and actually goes before then even. But for the sake of argument now, much of what I talk about in the book is from 1967, although I very much say that there was an occupation of sorts pretty much since day one of Israel. Palestinians have never been treated as equal citizens, of course, of that country. But so much of the arms industry did begin before 67, but hugely accelerated after it, after the occupation of West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights began. And over those decades since then, Israel has found huge numbers of ways to develop tools and technologies to repress Palestinians. I'm talking in the modern age of drones, spyware, facial recognition technology at checkpoints in and out of the West Bank. I'm talking about biometric tools in places like Hebron. And a lot of those tools are tested on Palestinians. They are trialed there. They're the guinea pigs, essentially. And often you then find, as I show in the book, they're often sold as so-called battle tested after that to huge numbers of countries. So, for example, Israeli drones, which are often tested over Gaza, not just during the regular Israel-Hamas conflict every seemingly 2 or 3 years, but also the surveillance over Gaza, which of course happens 24/7. And often those drones end up in various other places around the world. One of the places that surprised people the most since I've released the book, is to discover that the EU, the European Union, uses Israeli drones over the Mediterranean. They're not armed, but they are surveillance drones essentially, and they are monitoring refugees in that body of water and sending that footage back to headquarters of a group called Frontex, which is the EU's border security arm in Warsaw, Poland. And then the EU makes a decision, are we going to rescue that boat or not? And the EU has made a decision, although they don't admit this, but this is the reality of not really rescuing many migrants, and hence many of them drown. So Israel becomes a key part of that architecture. And the reason the EU would want to use Israeli drones, often they stay in the air for 40 hours, is because they were battle tested in Gaza. And that's how it works. So there are many, many other examples. Facial recognition technology that was trialed in the West Bank for Palestinians going in and out of checkpoints that end up being used in huge number of other countries, both even at airports or other places that are less benign. And in some ways, the whole concept of battle testing weapons, although other countries do it, the US battle-tested weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, there are stories now at the moment around the current war in Ukraine, where the US is often battle-testing weapons, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, many others, startups, surveillance companies, drone companies. So Israel's on one level not the only one doing this. The difference is with Israel that they've had for over half a century a ready-made occupied population on their doorstep that they can test weapons on, trial them on, and then sell them as so-called battle-tested to nations around the world. And huge numbers of countries aren't just interested in the technology or tools themselves because they want to repress their own people, but I think it's also partly just the idea of copying the idea that they can get away with it. That's not something you can sort of sell for an amount of money, but a lot of other nations, despite what some people might think, do look to Israel with admiration and almost ask, how do you get away with this? How do you occupy another population for over half a century and basically have carte blanche throughout the world to do so? So Israel, I think often, not always, but often sells that idea of wanting to promote the idea of impunity and how to try. Other nations could also try to get that too.
And finally, I'm wondering how the United States fits into all of this. They obviously give Israel over $3.8 billion a year in military aid, closest ally, you have supported them since 1948, but have obviously used them more directly for geopolitical control of the region since 67. People talk about how the occupation and the apartheid policies of Israel would be hard to maintain without this U.S. support. But what about this global kind of export of the occupation that you talk about? Where does the U.S. fit in, and how much of this is potentially connected to them?
Look, I think if the US, for example, dropped its military aid, and I know just finally in the last sort of 6 months there's been some more discussion around this, although it's hard to see Biden, for example, doing much about that, certainly in the first term, assuming he might even get a second. I think if military aid to Israel ended tomorrow, Israel would do just fine. I don't think they particularly need that aid anymore, and in fact there are many growing numbers of voices, in fact, on the Israeli right who say we don't want this aid anymore. It actually makes us far too connected to the US, a nation that always criticizes us and attacks our settlements. I mean, it's frankly incredibly light rhetorical attacks. It's not like the US imposes any punishment, right, on Israel whatsoever. I mean, in other states, though, I think the Israeli arms industry is a massive part of the economy. And Israel released recently the 2022 arms figures, and there was 12.5 billion US, which is the highest amount ever. In the last years, it's way more than doubled. And in fact, in the last year's figures, 24%, so essentially a quarter, were Arab autocracies. So most of the nations that were involved in the Abraham Accords, the Trump-era deal that essentially apparently was about Israel and the Arab states becoming wonderful friends, when basically it was an arms deal. That's essentially what it was. So all these nations, talking about UAE and Bahrain, and although Saudi wasn't in that deal, but they're certainly buying Israeli weapons, Morocco, they bought huge amounts of Israeli defense equipment, drones, surveillance technology, etc. And it seems likely that when the 2023 figures are released sometime next year, many of European states have massively been expanding their purchase of Israeli weapons after Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, purchasing missile defense shields and other kind of technology to what they view as protecting themselves for potential Russian aggression. So Israel's actually in a remarkably good position from its perspective. You know, there's been so much coverage in the last, 8 or so months now of all these mass protests in Israel, and clearly division exists in Israel. There's no question about that. But when it comes to these issues, defense sector, not much has changed at all. In fact, every indication is the industry is soaring. The only caveat to that would be if there was a mass exodus of people who worked in the defense sector out of Israel, I guess they could affect the industry, but there's no indication that's happening. There are some people who have left because they hate Netanyahu or hate what he's trying to do, or they believe that he's building a theocratic nation, which I fear he's trying to do as well, a Jewish theocracy. But there's no real indication of mass movement of Jews out of Israel at all, not yet anyway. So much of the world, in fact, is desperately keen for Israeli weapons. And I think when a lot of people are made aware of that, it puts into a bit of context the political goings-on in Israel itself. Not to minimize the divisions that exist, they clearly do, but the occupation is not going anywhere. It's in fact deepening, it's strengthening. You have a far-right Israeli government that is now openly, whereas before it was sometimes a bit more covert, but now openly supporting far-right settlers who are committing pogroms. And at least at the moment, that's having no impact that we can tell on the Israeli arms industry. And it's hard to see without massive outside pressure on Israel that changing.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a non-profit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.